Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our grants program workshop this morning. We are very excited to be able to provide this information to you and ask your questions, and very honored with all the enthusiasm that we've received with for this webinar. So, my name is John Wynn Yap. I'm the Outreach and Advocacy Manager here at California Humanities. Cam, and I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves. So, Luciana, you can go first.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lucena Lauvalle. I'm a program officer, and I'm here in Los Angeles. So it's great to talk with you today.
Great. Thanks, Lucena. John?
Hello. Hi, I'm John Lightfoot, Senior Program Officer based in the Oakland office.
All right. Thank you. Kirsten?
Good morning. I'm Kirsten Vega, Program Assistant based in the Oakland office.
Okay. So thank you, Kirsten. We'll be the ones providing information to you. You'll be seeing our faces and hearing our voices. After this slide, we will turn off the webcams just to keep our bandwidth clear, and then we will turn webcams back on during the Q&A so you can see our faces when we're answering your questions. And throughout the webinar, just as a reminder, please feel free to use the questions or the chat to contact us, and we will try to address all of your questions as much as we can. All right. So for our agenda today, we'll do a very quick introduction to California Humanities. Many of you are on our newsletter, so hopefully you know about us, but I'll do a quick run through of who we are. And today, our overview of our grant programs and funding opportunities will include our Humanities for All grant, our California Documentary Project grant, and our Library Innovation Lab hybrid grant. We'll talk also about application process and tips, and then, as I mentioned, we'll have ample time for your questions. So California Humanities, we are a 45-year-old organization. We are the state nonprofit partner to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Each state and territory of the United States has a State Humanities Council, and we are it for California. And primarily, we do our work through two avenues. One is grant making, and one is creating our own programs. This is our strategic framework. We are going to be refreshing this soon, but we like to show this just to show that we are approaching the state humanities work from various different spheres. So leadership, system change, grant making programs, as I mentioned. This includes field building, working with schools, working with the public, doing advocacy as well. And so some of you may have participated in listening sessions recently, and that's part of our field building. Many of you have been able to participate in public programs, either that we have supported or that we have produced ourselves. So that is all part of this work. So what are the public humanities? And we like to talk about public humanities because this is one of our main avenue with doing the humanities work. Public humanities are the humanities-centered learning experiences that take place outside of formal educational environments at any level. So this could be in the community, this could be at K through 12 schools, this could be at community centers. So these are examples of public humanities projects that we've either supported or produced ourselves. So War Inc. Featured stories about veterans and their tattoos and what those stories told about their veteran experiences. Straight Out of Fresno is a project that focused on hip hop in Fresno with a Hmong community. And Border Click was another project that was supported by us. And this is an example of a panel and bringing in people to discuss the project, the art, the exhibit, but also engaging in the issues that it conjured and discussed. As I mentioned, we do work beyond grant making, so some of us will discuss some of these examples. The Art of Storytelling is an actual physical exhibit that we have been running in our Oakland office, and essentially it's trying to bridge the gap of, or bridge the great stories that are being told, whether they're in our grantee projects or with our partners or things that we notice in the community, and then talking about how the human experience and what people are experiencing here in California are being told through art. This picture on the right is a piece by an artist here in Oakland for one of our last physical exhibits that we had in Oakland last year. We are More Stories by Queer Comic Artists. And we have shifted those to online because of the pandemic. We had our first online session last month featuring a panel with the filmmaker Tom Shepard and film subjects regarding the Unsettled film, which covered refugee and asylum seekers trying to resettle here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then Lucinda, can you talk a little bit about literature, medicine, and We Are the Humanities?
Yeah. So I can tell you a little bit about literature and medicine. It is a humanities-based professional development program that our organization has presented for over 10 years. And this program offers healthcare professionals, so folks who are working in hospitals, the opportunity to meet together, discuss works of fiction, works of memoir, and really use these texts as a jumping off point to think about the work that they provide to their patients. Right now we have 6 sites, and that is across the state, 6 sites that are across the state, and we are in the process of expanding. So if you're interested in learning more about literature medicine, please take a look at our website. And I'm happy to answer any questions offline that you all might have about Lit and Med.
Thanks, Lucinda. Can you also talk about We Are the Humanities?
Oh, yes. So We Are the Humanities, if I'm correct, was an initiative to hear from thought leaders, writers, artists across our state to reflect on their own experiences and reflections on the role of the humanities in their life and work. And if I'm not wrong, they are accessible on our website. So you can take a look at some of the great speakers, which includes actor John Cho, among others, but also Isabel Allende and many other folks who are living and working in California and really shaping the humanities in our own time.
Yes, you're definitely correct, Lucinda. They're available on our YouTube and also our website. Thanks, Lucinda. John, can you share a little bit about the California 2020?
Sure, thanks, John. Sure, so California 2020 is a statewide initiative looking at the experiences of young people in California and amplifying young Californians' voices. And there are multiple components. There are, grant making. There's opportunities for youth voices components to the various grant making we do. And then there's also a component called Democracy and Informed Citizen, which is looking at the sort of vital connection between journalism and democracy, and is in partnership with California community colleges. We're offering fellowships to emerging student journalists and presenting some public programming relevant to media literacy and democracy and the informed citizen.
Great, thanks, John. And the information on that is also on our webpage.
It is.
All right, so I am gonna go ahead and move forward.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who can apply, and I'm going to walk through the points that we have here, but there's some other details that we can kind of add to this. But we accept applications from nonprofit organizations or local or state government entities. So that includes public universities, libraries, museums, and others that meet the following criteria. So first, you should have tax-exempt organizational status, or if you don't, you should be working with a fiscal sponsor that does have tax-exempt status. Second, that you do not have an active grant or pending application. And there's 2 exceptions that I'll mention. First, that excludes approved multi-project fiscal sponsors or colleges. And most recently, that also includes recent recipients of our California CARES grants. So if you have an active California CARES grant, then you can, in this case, apply for many of the grants that we're going to talk about today. But if you have any specific questions about this, please follow up with us. We also are asking that recent or former grantees are in good standing with us, with California Humanities, and that means that you have submitted and received approval for your final report. which closes your grant up, your recent grant. And lastly, individuals may apply under the auspices of an eligible organization or institution. So what that means, again, is we go back to that point of fiscal sponsorship that we mentioned in the first slide.
Great, thank you, Lucinda. And if you have any questions about that, again, we will definitely get to those questions. Please post them in the question box. And if there's many questions around any of these topics, we will address it later in the webinar. All right. So key phrases overview, John.
Yeah, so in anticipation of some of your questions, excuse me, we thought we would address maybe the topics that come up most frequently and around which there seems to be the most confusion. So to get everybody on the same page, we want to just go over some of these key terms that in some cases are unique to our grant making, but in other cases are obviously general to anybody who's seeking funding. First point to note is about matching funds. Most of our grant programs require that the funds you receive from California Humanities are matched at least 1-to-1 in additional cash or in-kind donations. The exception for that is the Humanities for All Quick grant, but the project grants and the California Documentary Project both require those funds be expended during the course of the grant period. So you don't actually need to have those funds in hand when you apply. You need to say where you anticipate them coming from, but at the completion of the project and the submission of the final report, your budget needs to show that that match has occurred. And we can talk about that in more detail as we move along, but that's the basic overview. We also require Humanities Advisors for, again, most of our grant making. Quick grants is another exception there. But these are people who work to advise you in the process of completing your project by informing you from a humanities perspective. And they can be scholars and academics, they can be independent curators or journalists or people who have written and studied a subject and so have a perspective that can be beneficial to you, or they can be culture bearers, meaning that through their lived experience, they have a perspective that you really couldn't gather or get through a formal course of study. Those are the three main categories. The roles they play, again, is absolutely to be advisors. They don't necessarily need to be in or participate in the project you're doing, but it's great if they can be. And I'll say, I think one of the things we look for in reviewing grant programs is how fully integrated or involved that advisor or advisors are. Again, I'm sure there'll be many questions about that soon. As Lucinda mentioned, we don't make grants directly to individuals. Individuals need to work through a fiscal sponsor. And this is a relationship. There's a lot of information about fiscal sponsorship out there, if that's a new term to you, and I encourage you to look into it. But basically, it's a relationship between you, an individual, or a nonprofit or a non-nonprofit organization and a nonprofit. So they are the official recipient of our grants and bear full responsibility for those grants. They can't be what is sometimes termed as a pass-through, meaning they receive the funds and they give it to you directly. They need to be significantly, substantially involved in the project. And that's a relationship that you create on your own, but you will need to report on it, or when you apply, you'll need to tell us about who that fiscal sponsor is. And then project director. So in most cases, the project director is the person with the overall sort of oversight and administrative responsibilities for the project. And for undertaking the project. And it varies a little bit based on the various grant programs, but that's going to be our primary administrative contact when you submit an application to us. So it's just something to think carefully about. If it's a collaborative project, who's the right person to be the sort of point person for us administratively. And then finally, authorizing official. This is the person at the applicant organization or the fiscal sponsor who is authorized to sign off on the grant submission. And again, they're accepting responsibility on behalf of that organization for the funds that are received and for administering them, properly and appropriately. And we usually, sometimes project director and authorizing official can be the same, but in this case, we're making the distinction because there are two slightly different roles. And with that, I'd encourage if any of my colleagues have anything to add to that, please chime in.
All right. Here it says please refer to the grant at a glance worksheet. That's available on our website, and I actually linked it in the chat. In our funding opportunities page, it has a matrix of all of our grants and then information about what's required in each of those grant lines regarding these phrases up here, or these categories up here.
John, can I add one other thing?
Sure.
Just because this is a common instance. So everything you submit to us needs to be signed by an authorizing official. So if you are working with a fiscal sponsor, you just have to make sure that you get that signature. It's not uncommon that proposals and applications come in, and we have to fix that somehow. But anyway, just wanted to add that point because it's kind of an important step.
Okay, thank you, John. So I'm going to move on now to Humanities for All. So Lucinda, you're on cue.
Hi. Yes, thanks. So Humanities for All encompasses 2 grant lines that were launched about 4 years ago now, and these are grants that support public programming that touches on the humanities and that is deeply invested in the humanities. And so we have 2 specific grant lines that I'll be talking about shortly. But there are project grants and quick grants, and those are really those are really grants that support projects of different durations. And so if we can switch to the next slide, we can talk through a little bit more of the details. But the quick grants, for example, these are the shortest term Humanities for All grant. And so quick grants last 12 months. So that's a 1-year project duration. They provide $1,000 to $5,000 in grant funding. And as John mentioned a few slides ago, with the concept relating to the concept of matching funds, quick grants are the exception because no matching funds are required. They do not require a humanities advisor either. However, what I will say is that this grant program is really designed to support rigorous projects that provide a rigorous engagement with the public humanities that may delve into issues of community significance or community interest for the audiences that the project is being designed for. There are 3 rounds of quick grants offered per year. The next deadline is just around the corner, and that is going to close on October 19th, 2020. So what that means is that you will be able to access the guidelines and the grant portal starting on September 18th. There is a 2-month review process, and the funds are provided upfront. So after the decision has been made and announcements are sent out, then applicants are required to send back their contract essentially, and then you will get the lump sum of $1,000 to $5,000 at the start of the grant period. So I just wanted to mention that. The other strain of Humanities for All grants are project grants. And as I mentioned, they're a longer grant period. So this is really a grant designed to support a longer engagement, a longer sort of exploration of whatever topics that project is designed to examine. And that's a 2-year project duration. The project grants do require the involvement of at least 1 humanities advisor, and that's something that you would denote in your application and talk about that in your proposal narrative, of course. The project grants offer between $10,000 to $20,000 in funding. However, we should note that cash or in-kind matching funds are required. And as was mentioned a few slides ago, the matching requirement can include donated time, donated materials. It can include other sources of funding, whether it's provided by your institution or otherwise, or it can also include other grants that you've been applying to. And I saw a question earlier, someone was asking if you can have other grants. Absolutely. That's absolutely welcomed, and many of our grantees are using our funds in addition to other sources of funding. There are 2 rounds of project grants offered per year. The next deadline is February 2nd, 2021, and the project grants have a 4-month review process.
And sorry, I made an error in the slide. It's actually February 1st, 2021.
Oh, thank you. Okay, February 1st, 2021. And I will mention that another difference in the project grant funding structure, you will receive a portion of the funds up front. Because it's a 2-year grant period, you will submit a progress report or an interim report, and another portion of the funds are provided for the grantee. And then upon the closure of the grant, and I think it's like the last 10% is provided for the grantee. So that's, I think, something to consider if you're thinking about how you'll get your funds and how that will, again, sustain either a 1-year project or a 2-year project. Okay, and so we can kind of walk through some of the examples of different types of public humanities programs that Humanities for All grants have supported in the past. And I know obviously we're in a very different set of circumstances than ever before, but we can talk more about that as well. However, Humanities for All grants have supported community conversations, public forums, facilitated dialogues. These grants have supported interpretive exhibitions with accompanied public programming. They've supported lectures, presentations, and humanities-informed performances. I think that's important to note. They've also supported community-wide reads and reading and discussion series. They've also supported books, film, and cultural programming with significant humanities programming elements, and as well as oral history, story collection, and story sharing programs and other narrative-based activities, and of course, participatory projects that involve public research and producing content. I think obviously the key feature here is that now many of these types of modalities have transformed themselves, into virtual formats, and so that's also, welcome, because we understand that these in-person types of programs are not necessarily feasible nowadays. But this is just kind of a jumping off point to give you a sense of what, when we say public humanities, what these kind of grants look like, or these projects look like in real life. And so the other two details that we'll add, and this is specific to both quick grants and project grants, is that we have special focus areas. These are arts and humanities, so interdisciplinary projects in relationship to the quick grant program, for example, that supports a fusion of arts modalities with humanities-based investigation and knowledge collection and knowledge production, as well as youth voices, which are projects that involve and work closely with youth as the primary audience. One question that comes up a lot is, well, if we designate our project under one of these categories, will it improve our chances of, is it going to help our chances of being selected? And one thing I should mention is that these special focus areas will not give you an advantage one way or the other, but it's our way of supporting communities and modes of investigation that align with our strategic framework. So as John mentioned many slides ago, we are interested in working with youth and K through 12 audiences, and we're also interested in understanding how the humanities and the arts can inform each other, and this is our way of supporting this type of work that folks are undertaking. And we have a couple examples of previously funded projects. This was a film and discussion and lecture series that was presented in Placerville. And this was a project called Real Japan, Stories from East and West. And this project actually delved into the very little known history of a group of samurai that actually lived in this community of Placerville in the late 19th century. And so they involved historians who were able to kind of uncover this history that was very, not known by many. And they also included presentations on this history. They included screenings of Akira Kurosawa films, and also I think this was like a theatrical demonstration. So I think the key piece here is that you can see this is all happening for a public audience, so that again members of the public can both witness this information, but also take part in a participatory learning experience together. And a great example of a past Humanities for All project grant was an exhibition called Indignity that was organized at Cal State San Bernardino. And this was an exhibition that delved into racial stereotypes, and particularly the stereotypes and misperceptions that were bubbling up in the Inland Empire. So there were community members from different constituencies that created these informative panels. And then as you can see, there were also objects and works of art that were presented in this exhibition. But again, you know, that public engagement happened both in the exhibition itself, but also in the public dialogues and programs that this grant supported. And we mentioned transforming a project for our current circumstances. And a great example of this is a writing workshop that's called Zines to the Future. It's organized by Cal State Fullerton. And so the initial idea behind this project was to provide youth participants with monthly, or rather weekly, writing workshops that help them delve into different ways of engaging science fiction. So that was something that they were thinking about that, again, was supposed to happen in person. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this organization, this project pivoted to virtual workshops offered through Zoom, and they've done a phenomenal job. And so the students were able to hear from different experts in the field, make their own zines, and their project is still underway, of course, but as you can see, it takes, you know, obviously we are in very different circumstances, but you can still engage the public in very rich and thoughtful and meaningful ways, even though you can't see them in person.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lucinda. So now we're going to shift into some questions. So Lucinda and Kristen, you're going to jump onto your webcams.
So I see a lot of questions here about Humanities Advisors. So maybe we could just touch on, you know, what is a Humanities Advisor? How do you find them, and what makes them qualified?
Yeah. So I thought John Lightfoot provided a really great definition early on at the start of the webinar. And these are folks who, by virtue of either their professional experience, if they have an academic background in the humanities, or professional experience because they've engaged in humanities work, maybe like a journalist, for example, or additionally, a culture bearer, someone who is an elder in a community who contains all of the stories of a particular place. These are all really wonderful examples of Humanities Advisor. The role that they serve is that they can work with a project director in the process of developing the programming. So for example, if an exhibit is something that you're working on, this person may provide oversight into the research that's happening, or they may offer some recommendations based on their own bodies of knowledge, informing the shape of, you know, the shape or the direction or the scope of what your project will take on. I'm going to invite John Lightfoot to actually offer some examples of how this may happen in the documentary, in the context of documentaries, but that's what I've seen in relationship to Humanities for All grants. They may inform, or they may have a subject knowledge that can provide guidance for the project director if that project director themselves is not an expert in that particular arena. But maybe, John, do you have any insight in terms of how this happens in documentaries?
No, that was a great explanation, okay. I think. But I do think, I mean, the term we use, like around CDP anyway, is that they provide context, depth, and perspective. And so I think, particularly in the media world, there are always other perspectives you can rely on, or at least learn from, to broaden your perspective and frankly open your perspective. And so that's what we're really looking for, is people who can contribute meaningful insights that you may not have considered previously.
That's great. Thank you.
A few more questions.
Yes.
One is here. If can I apply for a quick grant for a project that's already underway?
No, unfortunately, you cannot. And I can offer some more kind of detail about that. So one of the things that is ineligible for quick grants is that this grant line cannot support projects that are currently underway or projects that are happening throughout the year. We recognize that sometimes your timing and our timing doesn't necessarily align. So that's something that I recommend if you have questions about before you apply, to please reach out to me. The grant period is stated on the guidelines, and that essentially what that means is that is the period when you will receive your funding. That is that 12-month duration for quick grants that begins again once the grant review has concluded. So, again, once decisions are made, the grant period begins, you receive your funds and you hit the ground running. With project grants, it's a little different. The eligibility is still the same. The project has to begin when on or after the grant period begins, but it's a two-year duration. So the development period is significantly longer for putting together the project.
Lisa, we also had several people ask for clarification around whether a project director and an authorizing official can be the same person.
So that depends on your organization, but the authorizing official is essentially the person from the entity receiving the funds that can sign off on that receipt of funding. So I hope I can explain this clearly. So I'm going to invite others. But say, for example, you are working with a nonprofit, and maybe you're not necessarily an employee of that organization. The fiscal sponsor in that case would be the person who would serve as the authorizing official, because they are acknowledging that that entity is applying for our funds. And I feel like I'm not describing it very well, but I would love to invite others to help me on this one.
Can I quote our colleague, grants manager Deborah White?
Yes.
She wrote to us, authorizing official is someone at the organization that the board has designated with signatory authority, someone that can commit the organization into a legal contract agreement with another organization, e.g. us.
Perfect.
So that was helpful.
Yes.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. No, that's exactly it. It's essentially, a person who is acknowledging that when that grant agreement signed, which is a contract, that that both parties are aware of what's happening and aware of the terms of that agreement. Okay, I hope that helps.
Susanna, I think the other major theme in the questions box right now is how does it work between applying for a quick grant and applying for a project grant? Under what circumstances can you have both?
Okay, so under no circumstances can you have both. You are only eligible to have one California Humanities Grant at a time. And we mentioned way back in the beginning that the only difference, the only exclusion to this case is if you have a California Cares grant from us. But in normal circumstances, you cannot have a quick grant and a project grant at the same time, nor can you apply for a project grant and a quick grant at the same time. The way this works, if there's any overlap, I think there's a few deadlines that have a bit of overlap. You will need to receive an official declination from one of our grant lines before you can apply for the other. So if there's any overlap, one of those applications will be ineligible. We'll reach out to you and say, hey, this doesn't work. This is out of guidelines. Choose which application you would like to proceed with. And I'll offer a related kind of example or a related sort of point. you can apply for, if you are a grantee that had one type of grant, like one quick grant, and you've closed it, if you would like to apply for a project grant after that grant is closed, that's fine. But there are timing limits and timing concerns that you'll have to connect with us, because again, as we mentioned in the very, very beginning, you have to have an officially closed and approved closed grant before you move on to another grant line with us.
Great. Another question that's coming up in the Senate is around COVID-19. People are wondering if virtual programs are an option, and they're also wondering if their project has unexpected setbacks, if we have flexibility around COVID.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, and it's something we've all been really giving a lot of thought to lately. So the first answer is yes. Virtual programming is absolutely supported. I might have mentioned that when we walked through that list of in-person programs, that any of those modalities, any of those types of programs can be modified for a virtual setting, because obviously we understand that we just can't get together like we used to. So yes, on virtual programs. The second piece is that yes, we do offer flexibility, and that's something that if, say, for example, the dates you thought your program would happen are not feasible given COVID-related circumstances, that's something that you would take up if you are awarded a grant. Take up with your program officer, and we can figure out a way to offer some sort of flexibility or an extension if possible. But yes, we are completely aware that things are different now, and sometimes projects are not happening in the way that you intended when you submit that application. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add onto this.
That sounds right to me. And I also want to mention, for those of you who are considering virtual programs, on October 1st, we're having an online panel around virtual programming with some programmers from across the state who have been experimenting with online and socially distanced formats. So we encourage you to join us, and I'll put the registration link in the chat. Also in the chat, you will see the link to register for the Quick Grant applicant webinar that's happening on September 16th. Luciana is going to be leading that. So if you're someone who has very specific questions about Humanities Advisors or eligibility for a Quick Grant, please join us. We can speak more with you then.
So now we're going to move forward. John, would you like to talk about California Documentary Project?
Sure. Thanks, John. Yeah, so the California Documentary Project is a longstanding grant program of California Humanities. And this is a grant that supports film, audio, and interactive media projects about California subjects and issues. They use the humanities to provide context, depth, and perspective, and have the potential to reach and engage broad audiences through multiple means. So that can be television broadcasts, it can be through podcasts, it can be online. At some point, hopefully, it will be back in person again. But really, we're trying to support accessible projects that tell California stories. And there's always a question about how much of a California story it has to be, and we can address that in the Q&A section. But it's one consideration among many. You see the image on the screen right now is on our website, where you can find information about the CDP grants. And John, if you could advance the slide, please. Thanks. Basically what I just said, and I guess to provide a little background for this, I think it's important to note that while California Humanities has supported media-based projects pretty much since the organization was founded as a means to reach a state the size of California, it's really important to emphasize and stress that we're not a media organization. As you've already heard, we're a public humanities organization. So with this grant program, our emphasis very much is on the content, the subject, the story you're telling, how you're informing yourself about the story, and that's really what our funding is intended to do as it relates to Humanities Advisors. Yeah, I mean, we definitely want to support creatively made, beautifully told stories and projects. But again, as our funding tends to be on the early side in the research and development and the production stages, it's really about the development of content that we focus on most. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the details and specifics, there are 3 main categories. For the deadline that's coming up in November 2nd, it's the research and development grants and the production grants that are available. The R&D grants are up to $10,000. They do require that match that we've discussed a couple times, and also requires the involvement of 2 humanities advisors that you've also heard some about. Their roles, again, can be, there's a wide range of options for their roles. They do not have to be in the piece. You don't, they're not there to undermine any editorial, sort of control or creative control, but they're there to be supportive advisors. Research and development grants are designed to be, though aren't guaranteed to be, sort of a feeder program for the production grants. So we love it when an R&D grant goes on and then applies for and receives a production grant, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. The research and development grant requires a written proposal and prior work samples. You don't need to submit anything currently in progress. That's one thing that differentiates the 2 categories, but for the production grant, you do. You need to submit a sample of the project you're proposing, so you've already done some production work. But similar to R&D, there's the 1-to-1 match. Grant amounts are up to $50,000, though they can range between $50,000 and $20,000 based on demand and the amount of money that we have, and the review process, which we'll talk about a little later, in terms of how projects sort of rank in the review process. Similar deadline, November 2nd, and I encourage people to look at the list of previously funded projects, because you get a good sense, I think, about the range of subject matter, approaches, and styles. It's really pretty extraordinary in that there's so many, such an incredible range of subjects, but also, I'd like to say as an organization, we don't shy away from projects that are trying to experiment a little bit in terms of how stories are told. So yeah, again, I encourage you to look at that list. The third category, which is not going to be, deadline won't be until the spring of 2021, are the CDP Next Gen grants. And these are designed to support emerging media makers ages 18 and under. And in a way, this is sort of saying, what else can we do to support the media field? And we really want to work on supporting those next generation of storytellers from throughout California. These are $15,000 grants, again, requiring a match. The grants technically and officially go to nonprofit organizations that have youth media programs. So that's important to know. The grants don't go directly to the young people themselves, but it goes to support them through an established program that already has some sort of curriculum and a media training program. I should mention also too that this isn't purely about learning the skills of filmmaking or podcast making. It's also thinking about media literacy in the sense that the advisor's role in this is to really help the participants think broadly and critically about the stories they're telling and the role of media in society. And again, that deadline is spring 2021. So in terms of a few sample proposals or sample projects that have been funded recently, I wanted to highlight the series, The Asian Americans. This recently broadcast on public television, is available, I think, on various streaming outlets right now. But this is a 5-part series, sort of on the more ambitious side of. I mean, we don't see a lot of proposals for big series like this, but I think this is still a good one to highlight because it's a California story, or it's got a very strong California focus, but it's a national story. And this is looking at the history of Asian Americans in the United States, history and contemporary life as well, and from multiple angles. But again, really grounded in California, but not limited to California. And they receive both R&D and production grants. And it's a good project to check out if you haven't seen it already. And then in terms of podcasts and radio series, so we've supported this medium, these formats, as long as we've supported film. We tend to receive slightly fewer applications for audio-based projects, but we absolutely encourage them because they're just really effective at reaching broad audiences. So these 2 that are highlighted here, The Stoop and California Foodways, I think are 2 good examples. The Stoop is a podcast series featuring stories from across the Black diaspora, And California Foodways is looking at food and culture stories from every county in the state of California. So both really ambitious, really powerful, thoughtful, well done series. Again, one with a very firm sort of footprint in California, the other related to California with California focus, but not exclusively California. These both are distributed nationally and often find themselves picked up by various national NPR outlets. But they're, again, definitely worth checking out as good examples of projects we supported. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the Next Gen Grant program, the YouthBeat is an organization in Oakland that works with the Oakland public school system to train young media makers, young storytellers. And we supported them maybe 2 rounds ago through the Next Gen Grant program to have support a youth-produced film called Displaced, about gentrification and displacement in Oakland. And the image you see here is from the opening night or for the premiere event where the filmmakers all were able to talk about the process. And it's available to see online. It's a great film and just really rewarding to see this process. I mean, again, it was definitely an ambitious project, but to see the process culminate with an event like this, I think it's very rewarding for the participants and for the audience. Oh, and I should just mention one other thing, just to underscore the humanities component to it. So part of this process was, yes, to get to some degree first-person accounts of what it feels like to have been displaced from a community where your family's lived for however long. But it's also looking into they did research into the history of redlining and history into the Oakland Public Library, talking with the Oakland History Room there. And so they were filling out the context in addition to connecting the personal stories. So connecting personal stories to a larger history.
You can turn on your webcams so we can see your faces, and then go ahead and start asking some questions, Kristen.
John, one question that's coming up is whether someone would need to apply to an R&D grant before applying to a production grant.
No. If you're already at the stage where you're eligible for a production grant, which is much, but not all, because you'll still be in some development of your story and subject, and you've got a good sort of humanities framework, and you've got a work in progress to share, then you can jump right to production.
Another question is about fiscal sponsors. It says, if documentaries are expected to have a fiscal sponsor, how can I obtain that before the deadline? And do I need to?
It's a great question. So yeah, fiscal sponsorship can take some time depending on which organization you're planning to work with. So fiscal sponsors can have their own application deadline and schedule that may or may not coincide with us. So ideally you have that all in place when you apply. But if for some reason you don't, and we don't encourage this, but if you don't, there is a 30-day grace period whereby you, after the deadline, whereby you can verify and confirm that you have that fiscal sponsorship relationship in place. We cannot make grants to individuals or that don't have fiscal sponsors. So that's kind of it. There's a 30-day grace period.
Also on the topic of fiscal sponsors, do fiscal sponsors need to be based in California?
For the California Documentary Project, they don't. For the other grant programs, they do. So that's one distinction. The emphasis here is on California content as opposed to necessarily California residency. So yeah, again, it's slightly different take, but they don't.
We also have a few radio and podcast folks on the line today, and they were wondering if we support podcasts.
Absolutely. Yes, we welcome podcasts. I think the main distinction there, and this is based on having read hundreds of proposals over the years, is that because this might be a little too technical, but because there isn't necessarily the same distribution system as there might be for film projects, and I know that's changing. It's certainly emerging. Just making sure that there's a really good distribution strategy so that the podcast you produce is guaranteed to reach as broad an audience as possible.
Okay, a question here about reapplying. It says, we applied last year for the research grant. We weren't chosen. Can we apply again for the same project? And can we get feedback to make our application stronger?
You can absolutely reapply. There's no limits on how often you apply. I should mention that in the review process, it's pretty much different every round in that there are different reviewers. So it's kind of a clean slate, and that's intentional. You know, obviously it's great if the project has progressed in some way. And yes to feedback, though, immediately following, when we send out declinations or when we tell projects that unfortunately you haven't been supported, there's an opportunity there to request feedback, and we encourage people to do that as much as possible because the information is fresh in our minds. But yeah, there's limited feedback available still if you would like that. You just reach out to me outside of this, and we'll set something up.
Another question about modality: can short film series or web-based projects apply to CDP?
Absolutely. There's the modality is absolutely open to what you propose. I think the question there that would come up is it the right format or platform for the proposed audience? That's the main question. So if you want to do a virtual reality piece, as we supported last year, that's absolutely fine, but it needs to be within a context whereby people will be able to access it and have a meaningful sort of impact on people.
A question about Humanities Advisors for CVP. The question is it fair to assume that the Humanities Advisor must be separate from the film director, even if they're a culture bearer?
So that's a good question, very specific. But I think the question, what would come up in a review of that proposal, and the project director can be absolutely qualified for that, no doubt. And if they're bringing some sort of personal experience to it, that's great. That's a definite asset. But I think the question might come up, it's like, well, could it still benefit from another person's perspective, right? So you're qualified for it, but it might make more sense to say, actually, there's somebody else who might further inform this piece. I'd encourage that person to follow up with me offline so we can discuss the specifics.
Okay. And I want to mention too that just like Quick Grants, we're having a specific information session for CDP. It's going to be on September 16th, and I'll put the link to register in the chat now for anyone who wants to follow up with John.
So, Kristen, would you like to talk about Library Innovation Lab?
Yes. So Library Innovation Lab is another one of our funding opportunities that happens once a year. It's a professional development program for librarians in the state of California that are looking to diversify their public programming and to reach immigrant communities and first-generation Americans. So this is an example of a program hosted back in 2017 by the Orange County Public Library. They had a series of calligraphy workshops and forums for community discussion about heritage and a number of other really interesting programs. So this year, as you can imagine, the cohort has switched over to virtual modalities, and they're really pioneering some of the first virtual programs in public libraries right now. So if you're interested in applying to this program, don't be dissuaded by the need for socially distanced programs, because we are still hosting it online. And then I think the next slide, John, has some more parameters about Library Innovation Lab. So just a little more background, we're entering our 4th year of Library Innovation Lab, which supports the design and delivery of programs that are responsive and relevant in California's public libraries. The program is about 9 months. Generally, we would have in-person meetings, almost like small, intimate conferences, where librarians can network with one another and develop their program plans. That's moved online for this year. I'll also say that it's a $5,000 grant to plan and implement programs, and the annual deadline is in March. So we will make the application public in early December of 2020. And if you have any questions, you can follow up with me and my colleague Felicia Kelly, who runs this program, and would be glad to speak with any libraries who are interested in applying. Thanks, John.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. And I'm going to go to the next slide. This is yours as well.
Thanks. Okay, so if you are ready to apply for an upcoming deadline, what you need to know is that all of our applications are online through SurveyMonkey. We have these grant portal links on our website, on our funding opportunity pages. And what you'll need to enter into the online platform is an online application form, which asks, basics about your organization, a proposal narrative, which is a written document. The length differs across programs, but it's usually around 2 pages for the Humanities for All projects. There's also a project budget and budget narrative section where you can outline your eligible expenses. And then our panelists and grant reviewers are also happy to review additional samples of your media work, a timeline of activities, and in the cases of fiscally sponsored projects, we ask for a memorandum of understanding between your organization and the fiscal sponsor. And if you have any more questions about fiscal sponsorship, since I know this is coming up, you can always reach out to Deborah White, our grants manager, who is an expert on this subject and is happy to advise. Her email is dwight@calhum.org.
Great, thank you. And she's also on our, she's also back here with us on the webinar as well. All right, so application tips. Thank you, Kirsten. Application tips. Lucena, would you like to share some?
Okay, no longer muted. So these are some general application tips, but again, if you have any specific questions, please reach out to the appropriate program officer. But these are some things that we have found that are helpful. First and foremost, make sure that your project is a good fit with our funding priorities and that the focus of your program is relevant to the grant program that you're applying to. If you're curious about if you're a fit or not, this information is spelled out in the guidelines. So I recommend taking a close look at those guidelines as well as our previously funded projects. Secondly, please make use of the resources that we offer, which are webinars like this one. We offer one-on-one advisement from the program officer, so we can talk with you and go through any of the specific questions you might have. We can provide samples of previously funded projects, like their proposal, more specifically, and each set of guidelines has a set of FAQ that goes into further detail into the different points that are outlined in those guidelines. We encourage you not to leave your proposal writing and application submission to the last minute. We recommend starting your application early so that you can get an extra set of eyes on your narrative if necessary, or this is very important, you can troubleshoot any issues with your computer, or if you need a certain program or a certain browser. All of these things take time, and the day of the application submission, you'll find that it's not enough time to figure this stuff out in advance. We ask that you follow the guidelines and provide all requested information using the appropriate format and templates if available. So for example, in the Humanities for All guidelines, we have very specific prompts, and I'm sure this is also the case with CDP. We have very specific prompts that we are looking for you to respond to in your proposal narrative. And for the case of Humanities for All, we also have a budget template that we require you to input your project budget and submit that into the application. And I know this is the case with CDP as well. So if we have a template there, it's not optional. Please fill it out. Next, we ask that you review, edit, and proofread your narrative and recheck your budget calculations before you submit. And again, it's always great, as I mentioned, to get an extra set of eyes on your proposal narrative, because sometimes you may think something is clear, but another person with an outside perspective can maybe flag some questions or give you some great suggestions. You can also reach out to the program officers give us a significant amount of time, because it gets very, very hectic the week before a deadline. But if you have questions, we're always happy to, again, provide some insight. And last but not least, make sure that your submission package is complete. Don't forget to attach all of the pertinent documents before you click submit. That's super important.
Great, thank you, Lucena.
Can I
John,
add,
oh, go ahead.
can I
Yes.
add one thing to that, which is it's for the programs that require humanities advisors, that's a great role for them before submitting the proposal. Have them look at particularly how you're articulating the humanities role in your project. And then just as a general reader as well, it's great first role for them.
That's really good, Ed. I think that's a great suggestion is, yeah, get their eyes on it because, again, if you're involving them in some way, it's good for them to know, again, how you are articulating the aims of your project. Okay.
There's also, could you talk a little bit about the signature and making time for that?
Okay, so this would be the signature from the authorizing official. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, as John mentioned earlier on, that is crucial because, as we mentioned, when you are submitting that application and essentially, that authorizing official is signing off on it, it's really important to allow for a little extra time because although you're doing it on the trackpad of the SurveyMonkey Apply application, sometimes, especially now that we're socially distanced, you want to ensure that your authorizing official has access to your login. So there's technical things like this that obviously in different circumstances you could go down to that person's office and bring your laptop or something. But nowadays, because we are not working in the same way, definitely allow for some extra time for figuring out these technical details. And yes, and having the authorizing official sign off on that application, it does require a little extra time. It can.
Yeah.
And can I add one point to that as well?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That is that for those fiscal sponsors that maybe handle multiple projects, like let's say it's the day before the deadline or the day of the deadline, if suddenly a dozen projects come to them and that they need to sign off on, there's no guarantee that they're going to be available at that time. So similar thing is get a head start on that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, good point.
All right, thank you for that. What happens next? So you submitted an application. What should they expect?
Well, they should expect that all your submissions will go through very thoughtful and thorough and rigorous review processes. They're different for each grant program. We publish the review criteria in each set of guidelines, and those are, I can't state strongly enough how important it is to review those in advance and pay attention to how what we emphasize and what is important to us. So as I say, they go through a multi-stage review process, slightly different for each program, but it can involve peer reviewers from the field, and certainly board members and staff. We look for as broad a range of perspectives as possible to sort of be brought to bear on the projects that are being proposed. We look for regional representation. We look for reviewers that reflect the diversity and range of experience in California. The degree of competitiveness varies by program as well, and I think it's worth, we publish those as well, I think it's worth looking at those. On average, it's about a 15% funding rate, which is pretty good compared to some funders out there, but it still underscores how competitive these programs are. The review processes take at different amounts of time as well. We've mentioned those maybe on earlier slides. But so we publish when the announcements will be made, and unless there's some unforeseen circumstances, we work really hard to make sure that our announcements go out on time so people can start their projects as proposed. In terms of notification, the project director and the authorizing official will be sent an announcement by email whether you've been selected for funding or unfortunately declined. There'll be options for obtaining reviewer comments, and usually I believe there's a link to the appropriate program officer or contact at California Humanities for you to reach out to get some feedback. Our processes for giving feedback differ as well, but the fact that we offer it I think is the main point. As asked earlier, we definitely welcome revised applications. It's good, it is a good idea to check in with the program officer though to see where there could be areas of improvement. But yeah, we definitely want to support or welcome the resubmissions. And then in terms of the funds being dispersed, Luciana mentioned something about this earlier in terms of the Humanities for All grants. So there's all the funds up front for the quick grants or in a staggered disbursement for the project grants. And that's similar with the California Documentary Project as well. For the Research and Development Grant, it's 90% of the funds at the signing of the grant agreement and $1,000 or 10% at the project completion. And for the production grant, it's 50% at the signing of the grant agreement and approval of the grant agreement, and 40% after an interim report, and 10% at project completion.
Great.
Colleagues have anything to add to that, please do.
No, I think you covered it well. And if you have more questions about this, please feel free to ask, send a question into the question box. I'm gonna wrap up a little bit and we're gonna have some Q&A after this. As we've been mentioning throughout the webinar, we answer questions. We love to be able to provide you information. So here's some contact information for various staff. So Felicia Kelly, a project evaluation director, manages the Humanities for All project grants, Library Innovation Lab. John, who we've been hearing from, managing the CDP grants in California 2020. Luciana, you can contact her for Humanities for All quick grant questions in literature and medicine. Deborah White, our wonderful grants manager, ask her questions about the application process or technical questions. And Kirsten and myself are here, and we can answer various questions as well regarding the application process, the organization, our upcoming projects, events, etc. We're happy to answer your questions. So these are our contact information, and Kirsten has also posted the link to our staff information and contact in the chat. As well, please stay connected with us. As we saw earlier, 75% of you found out about this newsletter through this webinar through our newsletter, so it's wonderful. Please keep connected with us. Please share the newsletter with others so that they have information as well. And then also follow us on our various social media accounts, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And as I've mentioned before, we will have this webinar recording up on YouTube and also our website within a couple of days. We're going to do some editing, but we will have it up soon. And then I will also send you all that link. So now we're going to go to questions and answers. And so to answer any additional questions you might have, Kirsten, Luciana, and John, we'd love to see your faces.
Okay, so I see a variety of questions for all programs, so maybe I'll just go back and forth between you, John, and Luciana. Okay, so one question for CDP, John, is does California Humanities support emerging filmmakers as well as established filmmakers?
Yes, we do, with one detail to emphasize, I think. You have to have some experience, right? You don't necessarily, if you're proposing, a hour-long documentary or something like that, you don't necessarily have to have made something like that before, but you need to have some experience. So we have a number of examples of projects of definitely emerging media makers supported through CDP who have gone on to just make some fabulous, fabulous projects. So yes, we're very amenable to that. I will say just one other point is if you don't have a ton of experience, it's a really good idea to enlist somebody who does as an advisor on the project, and that can really help sway reviewers and say, well, if so-and-so is working on this project, I feel confident that they can complete it.
Luciana, we have a question about scale for quick grants and project grants. They're asking if you could give some examples of the smallest things we've funded and the largest.
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer, but I can give you some examples. But I don't know if it truly demonstrates the breadth, but some of the smaller scale projects, let's see, writing workshops for a certain population. I guess the thing that I would kind of scroll back, I would like to foreground this with is that scale is, there's not one sort of ideal that we want to fund, something that's going to reach 1,000 people and that's the ideal. It's really about the depth of the project and the rigor of the exploration and how relevant whatever that project is will be to the audience that you're thinking about. And also, I think how feasible it is on the budget that you're articulating, that you're thinking, this is how we're going to fund it. So to go back, one thing I would say is, yeah, we've certainly funded some really beautiful, like close-knit groups that provided workshops for maybe 10, 15 people. But the other important piece of that was that there was a public forum that was able to present the work to like a wider audience. So, for example, a project that we funded about a year ago in Oakland is called Black Joy, and it included writing workshops for young Black men that happened over the course of like several months. And that was like 10, 15 youth working together. And then ultimately there was a public showcase and presentation of the work, and that was able to again take the work that cohort of 10, 15 young people made and brought it to 200 people. So I think that's something to think about. When it comes to project grants, for example, that's a 2-year grant period. So in that case, you all also want to consider what sort of development needs to happen during the course of the 2 years. You could certainly make something that will happen in less than 2 years, but thinking about whether it's workshops or you're doing a significant amount of research to ultimately present a project that is of a larger scale, like an exhibition, for example, the timeline of how that's going to happen will look a little different. So, I mean, thinking about like really, really large scale projects, we've funded symposia and public humanities related festivals that had thousands of people, but there's a real clear distinction in terms of what that focused learning will look like that will happen to the bigger group. So I hope that offers some information. Anybody else have some thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's perfect, Ms. Senna. And the other thing I would add is that we have put together a list of all the previously funded projects that we have funded. So you can find that on our website, and I've also put a link in the chat for those of you who would like to see some more examples.
Yeah, that's a great resource.
John.
Yes.
Over to CDP, someone is asking about how robust the work in progress would need to be, and they're wondering if it could be a short feature or a clip from a longer piece, or what does a work sample look like?
Well, if the question is for the production grant, you need to submit a previously completed piece of any type. Just shows that you've had some production experience. And then the work in progress for the piece that's being proposed. And in order to make it as level a playing field as possible, because our sweet spot, so to speak, is supporting projects that are in early production, in our review process, the emphasis falls on the written proposal. The work samples are certainly important, but the emphasis falls on the written proposal. So it can be a really rough work sample, but it should convey as much about your proposed project as possible. So some sense of if there are characters, who those characters are, what the central sort of theme is, what the central line of inquiry is, things like that. But again, we want to make it so that projects that are just starting out and they haven't spent a lot of time already gathering material are just as competitive as ones that are much further along and have maybe raised a lot more money.
Hi, real quick, just to clarify, John, is that for the research and development or production grant?
That's for the production grant.
Okay.
The research and development grant is just a previously completed piece that you have made, and yeah, nothing in progress needs to be submitted.
Okay, great, thank you.
We have a few other questions here. One question is actually kind of for both of you. It's about the question is, if someone is making a documentary, is it possible for them to apply to project grant or quick grant, or should they in all cases go to CDP?
Yeah, John, you go first.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. Okay, so there's always going to be a little bit of a gray area among the grants programs. The way I usually explain it is like, if your primary activity or primary enterprise is media production, then it's the documentary grant. If media is a component of another sort of public facing in-person or whatever virtual component, like collecting oral histories or doing video documentation of things, that in most cases I think would lean towards the Humanities for All programs. But there's always a little bit of a question there. So that would be a perfect instance where you'd want to get in touch with us and sort of ask that question and bounce ideas around with us.
Perfect. Yes, I second that. Yeah, I co-sign on that. And I think the thing to remember again is, you know, with Humanities for All, the emphasis there is really on public programming. And so, as John mentioned, if you're incorporating a documentary in a discussion program or something to that effect, that might be sort of a typical modality. But if you find that what you're thinking of and what you're planning on is in the gray area, then that's where, you know, it's good to just run it by the program officer, and we can talk further about it.
Okay, Deborah, you probably already know this one's coming. It's, do you need a DUNS number and a SAM registration to apply for a grant?
Hi, yes. So we will accept applications without the DUNS and SAM. However, it is a federal requirement that any organization receiving federal funds must have an active SAM registration. SAM is the System for Award Management. That is a federal organization. And so I'm alluding to that it is a federal process in getting that SAM's number. So we encourage you to start the process as soon as possible, so that if you are indeed awarded a grant, that we can actually send you funds, because we cannot send you funds if you don't have an active SAM registration. And the reason that the DUNS is important is because that's what you're actually registering with SAM, is your DUNS number. So the most important part is the SAM registration, not the DUNS number. Okay? Follow up, or we cannot actually do anything for you with that actual SAM application process. Believe me, I've tried. And so if you have questions for them, do the chat function and stay there. I encourage the chat versus the phone call, because you can continue to do work and they will come back to you. I have waited on that line for 5 hours twice, trying to help an organization, only to be told that the organization has to do it for itself. So again, I just encourage you that SAM registration is a federal process. So you want to get started with that process as soon as possible, but do not let that stop you from submitting your application.
Thanks, Deborah. Lisanna, we also have a question about the quick grant deadlines for 2021. Do you mind shouting those out?
Let's see. The next one is October 19th. And then the February date, I will need some help because
we haven't actually determined those dates, the exact dates. So just go ahead and give the months. Okay,
yeah. So we have October 19th around the corner. We have February, probably mid-February, and then mid-June after that. And that's what we have been planning around, you know, since the grant program started. So the specific dates will be released when we get closer to it, of course. And the grant guidelines are published a month before the deadline, so you can access the grant portal and also access those guidelines at the same time.
Excellent. Let's see. John, a question for CDP. Do you need to already have a distributor secured when applying to R&D?
No, and you don't need to have one secured when you apply for production either. If our funding is coming on the front end and is really to help propel you to the next stage, you would maybe want to say who you'd like to, play that role or where you'd like it to screen, but none of that needs to be secured at the time of application. But maybe I'm doubling back. But that said, if you do, let us know. It's not something to omit if you already have that arrangement.
There are also several questions in the chat about in-kind matches or matching, meeting your match. And I was wondering if each of you could just speak a little bit towards how matches can be met. Maybe Luciana, if you want to.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think we've provided a couple of examples, but sometimes that can be an in-kind donation. So say you are working with a venue and they're going to waive the fee to use a specific space. So what you would do is you would quantify whatever that donation is, and you could put that into your budget where it's relevant. The same thing could be, in-kind donation of labor or food or things that maybe, you might in other circumstances pay for with your funds. Another example is if you are applying for another grant and you're waiting on a determination from that other source. Maybe, you have a grant application that's under review. Put that into your budget. And if you have, other forms of institutional support, maybe your organization has project funds that they provide to you and you're using that to augment whatever our grant funds will provide.
And I'll just jump in with a couple additional points, and that is in the media world, there's a long and not very positive history of people underpaying themselves. And so we're not encouraging that by any means. That's not to donate your time to things. But there are instances where you might be working with somebody who has a commercial rate or a nonprofit rate. That difference can count as matching funds, or I'm sorry, in-kind donation. But the point I don't know if we've made quite yet, though, is that so the funds need to be expended only in the grant period. I don't know if we made that point. Anything you've spent prior to the start of the grant period is not eligible for a match, unfortunately. But that's just the arrangement we have with the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to add, that the matching requirement is because we need to actually identify our own matching requirement for the federal funds that we're expending. And so also remember that if you receive any other federal funds, those cannot be part of your match.
Good point.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And I will follow up by saying I did see a couple questions that people had submitted about, are there rates or do you determine how much people should be paid? We don't provide a recommendation on that, but I think what John mentioned is really important, is that, you want to make this a sustainable project, whether it's a 1-year grant, 2-year grant, or whatever. You want to ensure that the people who are working on the project are being funded for their hard work and being paid for whatever they're contributing to the project.
Yes, and I think now, as we're drawing to a close here, it might be a good time to mention that we have recorded this webinar and the Q&As, and we will be emailing a link out to everyone who registered. So if the information's coming quickly, you'll have another chance to review. And once again, our website has some really great resources, including guidelines for all of these programs, contact information for our staff, registration links for all of our informational webinars, and examples of previously funded projects.
Great, thank you that's a great wrap up, Kristen. Thank you to you, thank you, Luciana, John, Deborah, for answering the great questions that we received today. And yes, we will send out the link to the recording, and also keep in touch with us through our webpage and look at our events page, our calendar, because there's a lot of grantee program projects in there, but also some of our things coming up, including art of storytelling, focused on the Black Joy project that Luciana had mentioned just a few minutes ago. So we're going to go ahead and close up. Thank you again for your time. Please send us any questions along the way. Good luck with your applications, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Good questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.